Good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone. Before I get started, I want to thank Dr. Jean-Eddy St. Paul for inviting me to be on his panel. I'm unable to attend this year's Haitian Studies Association Conference because I have a conflicting keynote this Saturday. So I emailed Dr. Jean-Eddy that I would videotape and record my presentation on the Lakouism and Resilience and forward it to him this evening so he can present it to on his panel. Anyway, before I get started, I speak in the name of my ancestors, the father of my country, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, my grandparents, Saïl and Eugenia Mocombe, and all the ancestors who have come before me. My topic for Jean-Eddy's panel on resilience is on whether or not Lakouism, as practiced in Haiti, is a form of resilience, or is it an anti-dialectical or an alternative postmodern subjective identity or form of system and social integration. Now, the reason why I want to utilize Lakouism to accentuate the current discourse on resilience is because I see a convergence between the emergence of Lakouism in the 19th, late 18th and 19th century, and the contemporary phenomenon of resilience under neoliberal capitalism as it is articulated in social policy as well as in the theoretical discourses in sociology and political science. Now, there are two strands of resilience theory that I want to focus on. On the one hand, you have the Jonathan Joseph perspective, which accentuate resilience theory as a supplement to neoliberal, the current conjuncture of neoliberalism. So, for example, the move on accentuating the individual as a resilient individual, a responsible individual, is a result of the emergence of or the transformation of the mode of production from a industrial to a post-industrial society where the emphasis is no longer on the state as the provider of social welfare and economic growth for the individual, but on the other hand, the onus is upon the individual to provide and to be entrepreneurial, to be responsible for their own economic interests as well as economic position. So that's the one strand. On the other hand, you have the postmodern strand in resilient theory, which is emphasized by David Chandler. And the emphasis on that strand is the view of the individual, and this is building on the postmodern theory of Michel Foucault, in which under the current conjuncture, the resilient individual is viewed as an alternative subjectivity, which is counter-hegemonic to the neoliberal model. Although David Chandler in his work does not promote that position, he is simply highlighting it. But we have to view whether or not the resilient, responsible, entrepreneurial individual is a postmodern subjectivity that is counter-hegemonic to the traditional self-interested agent of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which presupposes the post-industrial stage that we're operating on. So, whereas on the one hand you view resilience theory and the emphasis on the responsible individual to provide for his or her own self-interest, as promoted by Jonathan Joseph, and on the other hand, you have this view of the resilient individual as an alternative subjectivity. Now, for me, I do not buy into the postmodern discourse whatsoever, because I do not view that the structurally differentiated individual, which is highlighted in identitarian politics, can offer an alternative discourse to the current within the current dispensation of space-time. So for me, this notion that the individual is somehow can articulate themselves as a counter-hegemonic subjectivity against against the notion of them as an agent of the Protestant ethic, I cannot subscribe to, because the only way a counter-hegemonic alternative discourse can emerge within a social system is it has to come from the outside, because all we get is structural differentiation within a form of within a discourse. Let's use the postmodern term. Within a discourse and discursive practice, no counter hegemonic force can emerge dialectically within that discourse and discursive practice, which is why I do not subscribe to the current strand and resilience theory, which highlight the individual, the resilient individual, as representing a new subjectivity. For me, counter hegemony can only come outside of the discourse, especially with the emergence of post-industrial society, which is why I want to focus on the Lakouism system itself. Because whereas if we try to extrapolate current theories of resilience to the 19th and 18th century, the 19th and 18th century Haiti, what the affranchis represent is an identity within the emerging liberal framework which constituted 18th and 19th century thought. So what you have is the affranchis, and then the Africans who would constitute the Lakouism system in Haiti represent the two strands of resilient theory, in the sense that the affranchis represent this notion that they represent an alternative or a counter-hegemonic force against an emerging liberal framework. Because we have to remember, what we have is the affranchis as well as the African are caught between two dialectical systems: mercantilist capitalism on the one hand, and an emerging liberal capitalism as articulated in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So what you find is the affranchis are caught, whether they're the Nouveau Libre or it doesn't matter. The affranchis are on the one hand caught between this dialectic, whether or not to constitute Haiti as a mercantilist state or an emerging liberal state within the emerging capitalist world system as articulated by Adam Smith. For me, they are not counter-hegemonic at all. They are simply caught within the dialectic, so therefore their subjectivity represents, they become interpolated agents of two dialectical systems: agents of mercantilist capitalism and agents of liberal capitalism. And I won't go and draw the distinction between the two. And on the other hand, outside of that dialectical mercantilist liberal framework, you have the Lakouism system, which for me represent this postmodern strand that we find in resilience theory, which want to articulate the new subjectivity that is emerging within a post-industrial framework as a counter-hegemonic subjectivity. For me, the Lakouism system of Haiti represents that dialectical, that postmodern alternative subjectivity to the dialectical mercantilist liberal framework that the affranchis are trying to recursively reorganize and reproduce. So the Lakouism system in that sense, if we want to juxtapose the two, represents an alternative form of system integration and social integration, which emerges out of the voodoo, what I call in previous work, the voodoo ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So they represent in the 19th and 18th century. Remember, Lakouism for me is not a reaction to the plantation system as framed by the mercantilist and liberal ideology of the 19th and 18th century. Not at all. For me, it is a distinct form of system and social integration, and therefore it interpolates the subjects of the system as alternative collectivities, alternative subjects to the mercantilist, liberal plantation system that the affranchis are trying to reproduce. Forward that to contemporary times. Contemporary times, the postmodern identity that or subjectivity that Chandler is highlighting are a product or supplement the neoliberal capitalist framework. And this is where we have to be sophisticated as theorists, because we have to see that the transmogrification of American society, as well as coordinations from an industrial to a post-industrial society, also results in a new form of being in the world for the social agent. So the social actor is interpolated as a different subject within the post-industrial neoliberal capitalist framework from the industrial framework which constituted coordinations 40, 50 years ago. So therefore, resilience theory, as Jonathan Joseph highlights, supplements the neoliberal framework, because it is involved in constituting a new subjectivity. Whereas, so we cannot view, which is why for me in my upcoming work on the two faces of fascism and neoliberal globalization, I argue identity politics and right-wing politics are two sides of the same coin. They represent two distinct subjectivities within the framework of a neoliberal capitalist post-industrial service society. So the powers that be are involved in constructing a new identity, what David Harvey called a new identity for the purpose of diversified consumerism to accumulate capital from diverse groups. So therefore, you interpolate or you decenter the subject so that the subject then becomes the onus or responsible for their own being in the world, for their own economy, for their own provision in the world. So therefore, there is no way, as an interpolated subject whose purpose is for diversified consumerism to accumulate capital, can ever be a counter-hegemonic collectivity to the current neoliberal capitalist framework that constitute our current dispensation of space-time. So therefore, for me, counter-hegemony can only come from the outside of the power structure. And this is a result of what Adorno and Horkheimer call in the dialectic of the Enlightenment. This is a result of the constitution, the superstructure as forming the framework by which the individual is interpolated and subjectified. So therefore, no longer, as Marx initially argued, no longer does material conditions determine consciousness, but on the contrary, consciousness as embodied in ideological superstructures such as the media, etc., schools, church, etc., are interpolated and subjectified to within different diversified consumer groups to accumulate capital for global transnational capital. So for me, as in the case of the Haitians and the Lakou system, alternative counter-hegemonic forces can only come from outside of the system, and we cannot view contemporary resilience theory as representing a counter-hegemonic discourse to neoliberal capitalism contemporarily. So if we juxtapose the two, and I'm going to conclude with this, if we look at how the Lakouism system represents a counter-hegemonic force because it comes from outside of the dialectic of mercantilism and emerging liberal capitalism that would come out of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So therefore, if we want to look at what would serve as counter-hegemony within the contemporary neoliberal framework, we have to look at the Lakouism system, and from there develop an alternative form of system and social integration as was articulated in the 18th century by our ancestors. So I will conclude with that, and that is my current project that I'm working on, which is in the form of a book which should be out next year, I think, called Lakouism, Libertarian Communism. So once again, I want to thank Dr. Jean-D St. Paul for providing me this opportunity to speak on the panel, and I hope to see you all next year. Thank you.